The Other Side of the Mirror, written and read by Elton Gar. Ivan opened his eyes. He was on a hard plastic bed looking up at the glaring white of a fluorescent light, a plastic pillow behind his head and an IV in his arm. His body should have been stiff from even a few minutes like this, but he felt better than he had in years. As he sat up on the side of the bed, he removed the IV. He saw that his hands were smooth, without wrinkles or scars from a lifetime of work. Not sure if he should be excited or terrified by his sudden youth, Ivan looked around more carefully, trying to remember how he had gotten here. He vaguely remembered a hospital, but not why he was there. The room was empty but for a small chair, a bed, a narrow table on wheels, and a wall across from him that was a mirror. He had some clothes folded next to him, so he put those on, and then checked the room's single door. It was directly across from the mirror wall. He found a small room, just big enough for a toilet and a shower. It didn't even have a sink. There was no other way out of the room. That meant for now he needed to survive with what he had here. The shower worked, and while he didn't love that being his only source of water, at least he didn't have to drink from the toilet. Food was less of a pressing problem, so he focused on trying to figure out how to escape, and the obvious first step was the massive mirror. He considered trying to use the bed as a battering ram, but he didn't want to sleep on the floor. So instead he tried to scratch the mirror, but when he neared the mirror he saw something odd. It wasn't as reflective where his shadow hit. So he got closer to the mirror and almost fell over as he backed away. It was one-way glass, and he could see something on the other side. It was dim, but the images outside clearly weren't human. One of the smaller of the scaly creatures pointed a long, thin finger at him and opened its mouth. He couldn't hear what they said, but he had been to zoos enough times to imagine a young child telling his mother what the animal they were watching was doing. Not sure what else to do, he went to the bathroom and shut the door. He stood in there for a moment, then sat for a few more minutes. He paced back and forth across the tiny, dim room, trying to convince himself that if he stayed in here long enough, that would mean something. But it wouldn't. It would just make him uncomfortable, so he went back out and sat in the wide, soft chair. He didn't need to hide, but he also didn't need to be interesting. After a few minutes, the tedium kicked back in. Not that he had anything more interesting to do. They could have at least given him a book, he thought, but he had worked plenty of boring jobs before. At least he thought he had. He really couldn't remember much. An hour later, a green-skinned creature, several inches shorter than Ivan, walked through the mirror. The mirror rippled as it passed through. The creature wore a large black plastic mask with breathing tubes and crept as if it expected him to attack it. It then set a plate of food and a large bottle of water on the table. Once it backed away from the food, it said something in a language Ivan didn't understand, and then slowly walked backwards through the mirror. Some part of Ivan wanted to refuse to eat. Perhaps if he starved himself, they would let him go. But he didn't know where he was or where he would go. All he was certain of was that this wasn't Earth. Over the next few days, Ivan fell into a routine. They brought him food several times a day, and the zookeeper seemed to want to communicate with him. So once Ivan convinced him he wouldn't attack him, they began to interact. Not in a major way, but he convinced him that he wanted silverware. It also seemed like he was expecting something more out of Ivan, as if he thought Ivan should be doing something, and soon he began to bring odd tools, and, as the zookeeper seemed to trust him more, he'd approach him with those tools. One of those poked him and drew blood. They must want to make sure that he was healthy at least. That explained why, once they were a bit more comfortable with him, they had someone come in every day and wipe down every surface with something that smelled a bit like alcohol. And every day it felt less like he was a source of alien entertainment. So, for the first time in days, he walked over to the mirror again. He put his hand against it, expecting to see more people outside watching him, but instead his hand just went through the mirror. It had never occurred to him that whatever had let the others through might let him out, but now that he knew he wasn't a prisoner, he didn't know what to do. Was it safe to just leave? If it wasn't, why would they have left the door open? So he stepped through. Before, all he had seen was dim shadows and people watching him, but now he saw it more clearly. A long hallway with aliens walking up and down it. One of them was pushing a strange-looking creature in what could only be described as a wheelchair, and another was holding onto a pole on wheels that had a bag hanging on it connected to his arm by a tube. After only a minute, the zookeeper moved next to him, but this time it seemed more clear that he wasn't a zookeeper. He still expected him to try to convince Ivan to go back to his room, but he didn't. He just walked next to him, and as he did, he spoke in the odd hissing and clicking language that Ivan didn't understand. But he suggested which way to go with gestures as well. And after a couple turns, he pointed into a room. There were several people there. Human people. Excited for the first time in 2 weeks, Ivan rushed into the room. The humans looked up and smiled, almost a dozen human. One of them said, "It's good to see that you're out of quarantine." "Quarantine?" Ivan asked. "Yeah, some of the first humans they dealt with carried some nasty viruses. They're having a devil of a time trying to contain it." "Can someone please just tell me what's going on?" "You're in a hospital. The hosts landed on Earth about a year ago. They healed you, but you didn't react the way they expected." "I don't remember any of that." A man took a folder out and looked at it, then said, "Oh, that makes sense. You had dementia. They cured you, but they have no experience with dementia. It seems like a lot was lost in the process." "I'm starting to remember some, but it was still blurry. I was just focused on why they were treating me like an animal." "Oh, that's a bit of a misunderstanding on their part. They studied human hospitals and were under the assumption that's how humans want to be treated." Author's note. I spent a lot of the last year in hospitals, and I'm grateful to the many kind and professional people who helped me heal. But while the people are doing their best, the system is not. So, this story tries to capture the feeling of isolation you can feel in a hospital. It's also an attempt to write something shorter and simpler. In keeping with that, I'm going to keep this short too. I hope you enjoyed this story. If you did, you can check out my newsletter at andsci-fi.com for more free stories, or visit my Patreon at patreon.com/Elton to vote on my monthly theme polls, read prose versions of my stories, or if you're able to support me at any level, get access to over 50 patron-exclusive stories and vote weekly on what I write next. Thank you, Elton Gar.